is there telling that particular story. I want to say a few things and give a few words here about Zora Neale Hurston and her approach in light of our conversation tonight about appropriation and preservation. So my main concerns here are going to be about who tells your story, what does it take to be able to tell the story, and why is it appropriation? We can talk about that some. And how do we overcome some of the resistance that is in this particular process that we are all here to unpack tonight? So the first thing I want to sort of lay out there is about who tells your story. I have it on some good authority. Maybe it's from our Spelmanites who were able to travel to New York early in the term and see Hamilton. If anybody knows about the superstar blockbuster musical that's on Broadway right about now, that regular folk like myself won't be able to attend until about 2025. I'm guessing. In terms of that, is it the final song, right? Is that what it is toward the end when Alexander Hamilton is sort of ruminating about who's going to tell his story? How will his story come down throughout history? The larger question that is out there about who gets to tell the stories has everything to do with who it is that filters the story through it, right? And so this is an ongoing conversation that has been going on in terms of the stories of a people who, during times of enslavement, were kept illiterate, right? And the fact that they would not have the capacity in terms of being able to write down the stories then meant they had to take those stories, as Hurston was wont to say in their eyes were watching God, into their mouths, into their hearts, into their minds, and that particular process of creation happened with them as they were walking around, doing their jobs, and living their lives. So that then that meant that the stories became part of the people, and when they were told, became then creations and continuously recreations of those people. Because if there's anybody who knew anything a lot about recreation, it was Zora Neale Hurston, right? And the whole aspect of her that we all know, in particular, is that for the longest time, nobody knew exactly how old she was, because that kept changing in a very fluid kind of way until you got the actual evidence, right, of the family Bible coupled with a younger brother. Because if she had been the youngest one, we still might not know how old it was she was. So the whole aspect of creating and taking on those stories into themselves and then retelling them was what was very important and central to what Zora Neale Hurston thought needed to be done. So, as part of her studies, and remember this is something that's also very interesting about her, with her having such a long trajectory in terms of her age and how long it took her to attain her education, she attended night school at Morgan in terms of getting her high school degree that way. She then moved on to Howard, HBCUs, and then moved to Barnard. And it was where she was at Barnard that it began to be understood to her, and that she fully came to understand how important it was for those stories to be taken down in some way. Now, I expect sort of the reason why I'm last here this evening is because linearly, chronological order, she is the last one, right? So she's looking back already at what Charles Chestnut has done, already what Joel Chandler Harris has done, and in terms of going and taking up the collecting of the stories as she started to in the late 1920s, thinking that she's going to go about it in a different way than what those two particular gentlemen had done. Her education at Barnard had afforded her, and for those of you who know, She had had her studies with Franz Boas, who she called Papa, to figure out how to get the closest that she could possibly get to the stories in order to be able to convey from the people who were, keeping in mind, filtering them through their sensibilities, creating them through their sensibilities to get those stories down. Now, in Death Tracks on the Road, which is her autobiography, she kind of freely admits that she went about it initially the wrong way. She went to Florida to collect the stories and went to some folk in a particular place and said, "Excuse me, do you have any stories that you might like to tell?" And the people whom she went to attain to get the stories said, "No, we don't know anything about what you're talking about in terms of stories. That guy over there might know something about stories. Right? The story, I don't know what you're talking about." She got nothing until she understood that she had to become, as Valerie Boyd said in her biography, Wrapped in Rainbows, of the folk in order to receive those tales. Now, keeping in mind that that's not necessarily the way in which she had learned at Barnard about how to obtain the stories. But continuously in thinking back upon her heritage, her youth of Eatonville, Georgia, and the strong foundation that Eatonville had been for her in terms of having that all-black town where she saw personally black people who were in control of their own lives, had their own agencies, were able to do their own things, thought that's the place to begin to go back and retrieve those stories from the place, and this is also something that she talks about in Death Tracks on the Road, the store porch, the place where everyone would sit in front of the store and exchange those stories. And she talks about how slowly, whenever she was a young girl, she would go into the store on an errand that her mother had sent her on because she wanted to hear what they were talking about. It's what young people do anyway. I know I did anyway. So whenever it came time to eavesdrop, you want to hang around, be able to hear what's going on, right? She finally connected that that was what it was that she had to do. And so she went back and became of the folk in order to be able to get those stories down. So it's certainly not the same kind of collecting that certainly Joel Chandler Harris had done in terms of what it was that he had taken up with those stories. But the way that she felt the closest that she could get to those stories. So in order to be able to do that, of course, she needed to have a certain kind of financial resource to be able to draw upon, and she had obtained that from Charlotte Osgood Mason, sort of the fairy godmother there in Harlem at that particular time, and to be able to note very closely with care, love, and attention what the people were telling her in terms of the story. When she had come up with the collection, she put it forward more or less in a very kind of academic format that was not well received by the publisher. They felt it was too academic. Most poignantly, what they felt was missing was Zora herself. Because again, if you know about Zora Neale Hurston, you know she was just kind of this out there kind of personality, as you might be able to tell from the story, right? No holds barred, etc. They wanted that brought across on the page. So it wasn't necessarily what she had envisioned in terms of collecting the folk tales, but in her collection, Mules and Men, for those of you who have read it, or have had to read it for one of our English classes here at Spelman, she becomes Uncle Remus and Uncle Julius in effect. That is writing herself into what we call, in terms of a literary aspect, the frame, right? So sort of the frame that surrounds the woman in the Keys story, for instance, comes from the mouth of Matilda. And it's very interesting to see how that frame, where she's just traveling along, collecting the stories, just sitting there listening to people talk, right, while she's there with them, participating in their activities, and she's also in that frame documenting more of the customs of those Negroes of Florida at that particular time, right? So people know from the beginning of Mules and Men that one of the activities that she engages in terms of collecting the tales is that she attends a tow party. And everybody's looking at me like, what? Do you really know about what the tow party was? Where all the women are like behind this curtain and they can just see their toes, and this is how the men make their selections. Yeah, the tow party. See, that looks like a very eclectic kind of custom, like that. You know, I guess we're still not doing that in terms of that. But in the frame, as she's part of it, relates that. What the practice of the tow party is, the kind of food that is cooked there. The tow party or slightly after that when they engage in the drinking of something called kundik. Right? You always like to hear that particular part. Oh, Dr. Riggins, don't say that. Yeah, well, that's what she calls it. It's the kind of the moonshine liquor that they're all drinking in order to be able to further enjoy the party, which just burns out fierce when it goes down, too. It's not a very safe drink, let's just put it that way. So within the frame, as she's hearing people, that's how the tales get inserted. And the frame, as well as the stories, reflect one another, very much so, because these stories have been filtered through the sensibility of the people who are there telling them. So the woman in the Key stories, for instance, you've got a lot of taste of gender relationships, right, and how they're fraught with a lot of tension and conflict about who is going to have control and say over what. That was certainly another thing that was reflected within the frame. Another aspect that's reflected there that might have struck some people, the prevalence of domestic violence in terms of that balancing of power, as it were. Aspects of religion, and sort of another way in which, and this Zora herself being a PK, we say preacher's kid, right, that she came to this understanding of the preacher, that her father, as an artist himself who was able to bring across the stories of the Bible. His sermons, as she thought about them, were artistic creations, that he was making sure that his congregation understood the meanings, the central meanings of those biblical stories. And so religion and using God and the devil and all of those things were ways in which she utilized that particular sensibility to show how important or how it figured into the lives of those people, when really it had been something that had been impressed upon them from enslavement, how they fought to make Christianity something of their own. So that way, which again, not the academically accepted way, that's the whole, being with the people but being distanced from them, pardon me, do you have any stories, kind of aspect that she took on, kind of meant that the flavor of what we get in terms of the folklore in Mules and Men is so rich and so real, right? But that meant that for the longest time, and this was up until relatively recently, that she was not widely accepted in terms of academic circles, right? But which, if you think about it, it's a little bit disingenuous, to say the least. Joel Chandler Harris is certainly a filter between the original tellers of the stories and the stories themselves. Nobody's looking at it in that way, right? So for Zora to go and be at the tow party and write down, the things that she's hearing there is a filter, but is the same kind of filter in terms of that. And these are the larger questions in terms of that. The larger question becomes then is, what do we do with it? It's a recognition, right, that there is a filter in place, but the preservation part is saying that at least there is something that we have from those people in terms of the ways in which they executed their creativity, the positive feelings that they had about each other, the ways that they saw life, the ways that they practiced religion. I mean, we're using men, particularly that appendix in the part which includes all that other stuff, advice about how to keep your man, medicating yourself. There's a whole lot of stuff back there that's very like, I don't know, I'll just take a pill in terms of that. But you wouldn't know those things if she hadn't fought to get as close as she possibly could to the subjects at hand. And so part of this, and this could be any of the questions that people have to ask, things that they have to say, becomes then this whole project of, it may be that there are these filters in place, but how do we get about the business of appreciating what it is that we have once we acknowledge what those filters happen to be? And when I teach Mules and Men, Chad probably have Karis come to my class more often and do her reading for the students. But part of the purpose in the way that she puts down the words of the people in their language is so that you can hear what it is that they are saying. Students complain a lot, and they don't complain. Maybe they just mention it, which I hear a complaint in there somewhere, where it's saying that it's hard to read, right? She meant for it to be hard to read. You have to speak it, right? Very much like Janie and Phoebe, if you remember in Their Eyes Were Watching God, my friend's tongue is in my mouth, right? You have to take that on, just as they took on the stories, in order to be able to get the meaning of what it is that is being said. So either you have a character, maybe, some other way in which those stories become oral for you, just as they were oral for the people who told them, right? There's not going to be the ways in which you're going to receive that meaning quietly in reading. She was not going to have that. So it's almost as if, yeah, she got you, right? Whenever it comes time to read those stories in Mules and Men in terms of that. So the language, I think, for some students, when they see that phonetically AAVE, African American Vernacular English, being written down is problematic, but that was entirely her intention and meaning. And I certainly think that Zora would be someone who would come to an understanding about all the students here who know from ADW, that Merle Collins poem, right? What she has to say in the last stanza, right? Tales of hunting will always glorify the hunter until the lion has what? Her own historian. That's what Zora Neale Hurston was trying to do, was to be the historian, be the historian for her people. And she certainly did, because otherwise we wouldn't be here talking about her.
Thank you.